Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Andy Campbell and this is 12 and a half minutes, your weekly hit of hope, information and inspiration brought to you by Elevator, one of Scotland's leading business and entrepreneurial support organisations. We go out each week live Friday at 3 o'clock on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and you can follow us, you can like, you can comment, and you can subscribe to any of those platforms. So at Elevator, each year we help thousands of new startup businesses get established and start off in their entrepreneurial journey. And one of the most important things that any company can do is carry out their market research. It's really vital to any business and the success of that company going forward. At Elevator, we call this the discovery phase, where you go out into the marketplace, carry out your research, you understand the pain points of your customers, and you then take that information and develop your business around it to get something called product market fit. But it also establishes credibility. And if you're going out to the investment community, having credibility in your market research is vital. But it's not just in business that credibility is important. In the business of book writing, credibility, that research is so vital, and it is the difference between a potential bestseller and maybe your book not being picked up or published at all. So I'm delighted, therefore, to be joined by award-winning, best-selling author, Peter May. Welcome, Peter.
Hi there, Andy. Nice to be here.
How are you, sir? Are you doing okay?
Yes, not bad at all. The sun's shining, had a nice lunch. So, yeah, all's well with the world, apart from the virus, of course. But
we'll get on to that in a minute. And I understand that your lockdown location is slightly different from perhaps the weather that we're suffering here in Scotland at the moment.
Yeah, I live in southwest France. So here it's called confinement, as opposed to lockdown, confinement. Which is a good way of describing it, because we were confined to quarters really for the last 3 months, with very occasional ventures out once a week to get essential shopping and then back in again. But, you know, I've been very fortunate in that we have a nice house with a nice big garden and a swimming pool, and the weather's been fantastic. So, and I work from home anyway. So, you know, being stuck here was no different from usual, really.
It's not been too much of a challenge. Well, that's great to hear, Peter, and thank you so much for taking time to join us today. And what I'd like to do now is just hand over to yourself, Peter, to give us an introduction and overview for some people who may not know you. So over to you, Peter.
Well, I think probably the most important thing to say, first of all, is that I always wanted to write from the moment I was conscious, really, of being alive. I wrote my first book at the age of 4, which may sound a bit weird, but my parents, my father was an English teacher, my mother was an avid book reader, and they taught me to read and write at a very basic level before I even started school. So the first thing I did with those basic tools that they provided for me was write a story. It's only about 6 pages long, with about 6 words per page. My mother showed me how to sew the pages together, just like a real book. And that was how it all began for me. I even have a recollection of lying on the floor of our living room writing it. And, you know, everything in my life kind of stemmed from that. I wrote all through my primary school years into secondary school. I wrote my first book, serious attempt at a book, when I was about 14 or 15. Didn't get it published, of course, and moved on, then wrote another book, which got me an appraisal from a very well-known book editor, which gave me a huge amount of encouragement, although he wasn't going to publish at that stage. And I leaving school, moved into journalism because that was the way I saw of being able to make a living. Because, you know, in those days, particularly in those days, there was no career path to becoming a writer, no creative writing courses at university. So you had to follow whatever course would provide some kind of income, because, you know, you had to work. And so I trained as a journalist, got a job in a local newspaper in Paisley, and then moved on to the Scotsman. I was in newspapers for 8 years, I think. While I was there, I won the Scottish Young Journalist of the Year award, and I got my first book published, which was called The Reporter, a book you might have guessed by now about a journalist, an investigative journalist. That got adapted into a TV series called The Standard, which was a 13-part network BBC drama series. It was in 1978, and that propelled me out of journalism and into television. And then really for about the next 17, 18 years, I worked in television. The mainstay of that initial period in television was a soap opera that most people will probably remember in Scotland called Take the High Road. Take the High Road, I was script editor and story editor. I wrote literally hundreds of episodes of it until I quit in 1988, trying to branch out and do other things. I spent 2 years virtually unemployed, and then was commissioned by Scottish Television to come up with a series that would be in the Gaelic language, and that was created and developed by my wife and myself. It was called Myka, and became very well known Scottish subtitled drama, first of its kind. I left that in 1996 to pursue a life as a novelist and try and make a living at that, which fortunately in the end I've been able to do.
Oh, that's fantastic, and a lot of people watching will be able to, certainly remember Myka and Take the High Road, and of course, being a Paisley boy myself, your time at the Paisley Daily Express, I'm sure, was one of the highlights of your career, Peter.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned about your first book, and you mentioned about that investigative piece. And journalism certainly gave you a really good grounding in creating or having that skill set to be able to dig into a subject and maybe uncover some of the facts and details that you need to be able to write a convincing or compelling editorial piece. Is that correct, Peter?
Yes, I mean, journalism was, it wasn't how I wanted to make my living as a writer, but I learned many valuable lessons as a journalist, how to write under pressure, how to write quickly, and almost more important, or most importantly, how to research a subject fast, how never to be afraid to ask for help. You would be given a deadline very often, 2 or 3 hours, and sometimes you had to do a lot of research into a big subject, something that you might normally take weeks to kind of work on and digest, and you just don't have that time. And so you have to pick your sources well, you have to pick their brains well, and you have to distill it all down. And that has stood me in very, very good stead as in my career as a novelist.
Yeah, and that research piece, Peter, is something that's very clear in all of the books that I've read. I was tipped off on this author called Peter May by Chief Executive of Elevator, Professor Gary McEwen, who got me on to listening to your books on Audible. So I started, of course, with the Lewis trilogy. And the thing that strikes me about your writing, Peter, is that you do go the extra mile into that research piece. Whether it's from GM modified crops, or whether it's into the impact of dementia, or perhaps now into flu pandemics, you really take time to go about researching very thoroughly. What's some of the things that you do in order to ensure the authenticity of the information you're providing?
Well, the key to it is finding an expert in the subject that you're researching, or more than one expert. But primarily, generally, it's good to have a single source, somebody who is an absolutely acknowledged expert in their field, who is willing to help you and whose brains you can pick. And there are plenty of people who are willing to help you, but they don't necessarily know how to help you. It's because writers require a certain kind of information, and they require it delivered in a certain way. And there are some people who simply, even though they're total experts on their given subject, don't have the understanding or the imagination to be able to put themselves in your shoes and cherry pick the information that's necessary to be able to tell a story. But I've been very fortunate in finding experts along the way who've been really good at that. One in particular, my pathology advisor for the last more than 20 years, who actually wanted to be a writer himself and had an early stab at writing a novel. So his imagination was working in the right way right from the start. So he's been a fantastic source.
Yeah, and you take great detail in describing the worlds that your books exist in. One of my favourite books to flick through, because after reading the Lewis trilogy, and then you look at the pictures behind it, you connect. You can realise that you told those, you talked of those landscapes so beautifully in your books. But you've not just been focused on Scotland; you've been focused on China as a subject matter in some of your books, Peter.
Yeah, I've done a lot of traveling, and the books have taken me around the world, and I hope I've taken my readers with me around the world. Yeah, I spent 6-7 years going backwards and forwards to China to research my 6 China thrillers, and that was one of the highlights of my life. Really, a phenomenal experience. I was the first Western writer to get access behind doors that normally closed to foreigners in China, the Chinese justice system and police. And I had just the most remarkable access to things that it would be hard to imagine even now getting access to. And that enabled me to write with absolute confidence about the Chinese police, how they operate, and hopefully be able to imbue my readers with that sense of authenticity.
Yeah.
About the subject matter, but also about the place, about China. I mean, China itself is such or it certainly was and probably still is, an assault on the senses in so many ways, and particularly culturally. And you know, I wanted to describe that and bring that alive for my readers. So I you know, and my last book was set in Spain. I have a series of 6 books set in France. I've got a book set in Scotland. I've a couple of books I've set in the United States. Yes, I like to travel, and I like to think that readers enjoy journeying with me.
Well, let's talk about your current book, Peter, Lockdown. Now, I'm correct in saying that you didn't wait for this pandemic to happen and then very quickly got onto the computer and typed up a novel. The origins of Lockdown actually go back to 2005. Is that correct?
I wrote it in 2005, yeah. I mean, the origins of the story actually go back to about 1999, 2000, when I was writing one of the China series, which was about terrorists isolating and weaponizing the Spanish flu virus of 1918. And that's where I began my interest in, you know, viruses and pandemics, and did a huge amount of research on that. And that led me through and then an interest in SARS, and finally that led me to bird flu, which was what scientists and doctors were predicting would be the next major pandemic, and that was in 2005. And I wrote Lockdown at that time, and it's a 24-hour fast-paced thriller set against the backdrop of the city of London completely shut down by a lockdown due to the bird virus. And at the time I couldn't get it published because well, I'm a crime writer, and editors said, well, you know, this is more like science fiction or fantasy. I mean, you know, it's not credible that a major capital city in the Western world could be completely shut down by a virus. So, you know, they didn't want to publish it. So, you know, it lay in a drawer for 15 years until, boom, up pops a real pandemic, and suddenly it was in huge demand.
Yeah, and I'm correct in saying that, you know, it sat there in a Dropbox folder, and when the pandemic as we know it has hit, it was suggested that you maybe use that as subject matter, and your publisher got on saying, well, we need to go quickly with this book, and the book was published, and I have started listening to it, and the parallels in there are quite scary. I'm sure you've been watching the news as this lockdown has unfolded, and you've been quite perhaps scared with the similarities, but that's all based on that good research that you did at the start, Peter.
Yes, I mean, research is the foundation for any subject that you're going to tackle, and it was very thoroughly researched. At the time, I found pandemic preparedness plans, which have been put together by the National Health, the Health Protection Agency, and one of the American health agencies. So I had 3 of these documents to look at and see exactly how governments predicted they would respond in the event of a major pandemic. And obviously all the background research I did on the bird flu. And so I was able from all that information to put together a picture of what I thought would be the reality of a lockdown, which of course people didn't believe at the time. But when I reread the book, just before its recent publication, I was quite amazed at how much of the detail I had got right.
Well, it's a few chapters in, Peter, and it's got me hooked. And it was also great to hear that, Peter, that you donated your entire advance on the lockdown book to causes and organisations who are currently fighting the fight against COVID. So it was really great to hear that, Peter. 12 and a half minutes has been and gone already now, Peter. It's in any one of those subjects that we could have dived in for a much deeper, much more thorough talk on the subjects. But it's been brilliant to have you on board. And clearly, Lockdown is the current book. I would advise anyone, you can buy it, or you can get it delivered to you, or you can even listen to it on Audible. And the next project, Peter, is that underway already?
It is, yeah. I had to abandon my original plan because I was going on a research trip to Svalbard and the Arctic Circle for the next book, which had been really well developed at that stage, but I had to cancel the trip. So yeah. I've adopted Plan B, and I'm well into that now.
Good stuff. Well, excellent, Peter. Thank you so much indeed for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully your lockdown continues to be fruitful with the writing, Peter. Thanks very much indeed.
Cheers, Andy. Thanks very much.
Well, that was the fantastic Peter May, author of many, many books, and of course his current bestseller, Lockdown, which you can pick up as we mentioned. So thanks very much to Peter for joining us, and thank you to everyone who has taken time to tune in today, or who are watching this back. So thanks very much for your continued support. Next week, we have another fantastic guest, entrepreneur, gym owner, athlete and coach, Rob Lawson will be joining us. But in the meantime, do have a wonderful weekend and be brave.